All right, good morning everyone. My name is Ethan Plotkin. I'm the CEO of GDCA. We're a legacy equipment manufacturer. We partner with embedded OEMs to help them solve the age-old dilemma. Do they end-of-life products to protect their bottom line and leave customers hanging? Or do they continue taking products and then protecting customers, but then undermining their bottom line? And we do that by basically providing innovative alternatives to address that dilemma. So before I kind of get into what we really want to talk about today around unlocking OEM potential by mastering legacy support, I wanted to actually do a little bit of recap over the last couple of years of the VITA and ETT conferences, of what we've talked about with the arc of the conversation. So back in 2018, right down the road in Austin, we really talked about the challenges and the reasons why OEMs don't necessarily change, right? And this is a change from the traditional approach to managing legacy. And that's the classic end of life of product. And then when a customer comes back, just kidding, we'll take the order. And then continuing kind of that sustainment slog. Too long didn't read. A lot of it has to do with a lack of compelling alternatives, inertia, right? The tendency, people just don't want to change, and then a little bit of fear. And then in 2019 in San Diego, good times, really tackled a lot of the challenges that people have related to, what's really the value of legacy products? And the too long didn't read on that presentation was basically that, OEMs are leaving money on the table unless they can figure out a way to contain the costs of legacy products. And then in 2020, a fateful month, just a couple of months before the pandemic in Atlanta, really talked about the 80-20 principle and kind of attacked how, the sales track to overhead. And essentially really using that to help OEMs understand the true cost of sustaining legacy and that bottom 1% of top line sales and how that really has a huge impact on a lot of the overhead. And then the arc continues. Last year in Fort Lauderdale, what we did was I talked about supply chain resilience in my role as supply chain chair of the National Defense Industrial Association Supply Chain Network Committee. Really in the Beltway and domestically, it's about the great power struggle that is really emerging between the United States, its allies, and China, and how embedded obsolescence really factors into that supply chain resilience and how OEMs and LEMs can be better together. We don't have to stand alone. So today, I want to talk a little bit about a greater understanding of what it means to master legacy support. So a quote I really love is, to understand something is to change it. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we've changed the thing itself, but we absolutely have changed our perception of the thing. I have this old picture of bloodletting back in the day when we thought bad blood made you sick, and we would let blood out of people. Now, of course, we understand that that really does undermine people's good health. But all that to be said is that today I really want to talk about what it means, a different understanding to master legacy support, how it works, and what it's worth. Okay, but before we really get into talking about what mastering legacy support is, let's talk about what it isn't. And I think it really isn't a lot of what the traditional approach for managing legacy support is. And that is, it's really not about taking nuisance orders for customers. And it's not necessarily about squeezing the last little bit of value out of a decade-old design. And it's not about figuring out how many obsolete components to pre-stock so that you can just keep taking orders. I mean, all of these things, which are the traditional approach to managing legacy support, they really do undermine every aspect of the business. They inject risk, they create customer liabilities, and they divert resources. But let's talk about what mastering legacy support really looks like, right? It's about improving operational efficiency by driving out what I call the legacy surcharge. This is the little bit of extra over and above standard operating procedures and resources that impacts every single person's team for every single legacy order, from customer sales to engineering to procurement to operations. And you add that up for every legacy product and you have that 25% of overhead, which really is responsible for the bottom 1 to 4% of your sales revenue, which is your old legacy products. Okay. So, but what does mastering legacy support mean? Okay, it really does mean, if you can master it, improved operational efficiency, right? By driving all that legacy surcharge out. Okay. It also means driving for innovation, specifically by eliminating distractions from your engineering team. That's usually the bottleneck. And finally, it really is about differentiating yourself from your competitors, because let's face it, I think there is a problem with ongoing demand for legacy products in our industry today, and I think anybody who can figure out how to do it is going to have an advantage. So, many years ago, when I was first kind of getting into the industry, I was meeting with a German OEM at their factory. This is not an indictment of Germans at all. It just happened to be a German OEM. And we were talking about a lot of the problems that they were having with their legacy products, all the usual stuff, engineering distraction, and customers a little frustrated while they were waiting for quotes. And at one point in the conversation, I said, hey, it looks like you guys are having a little problem with your legacy products. And the response I got was, no, we can absolutely do legacy products. We just can't make money at them. Okay? And I kind of took a moment, and that was a realization point for me when I really understood that, you know, just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should do it. And also, if you're doing something in your business, which is the point of the business is to sustain itself and make money, and you're not making money at it, it's probably a good opportunity to rethink the way you want to handle something. So, what are the challenges that are keeping OEMs from really mastering legacy support? And I think there's a number of factors that I see over and over again. I think a lot of folks in this room can relate. First thing, priorities. Legacy products are always lower priority than active products, core products. Resource constraints, right? They divert resources, which means this is why a lot of times legacy product support take longer, and then they just kind of hang around in the gullet of our businesses for much longer than active products. Process exceptions. Pretty much everything about legacy products is an exception, creates exceptions to business as usual, right? As I mentioned earlier, from customer sales and support all the way through the company, which kind of creates science experiments, right? Now, we all know what a science experiment is from school, right? It's something that you go into, you don't exactly know how it's going to turn out, right? But you'll know in the end. And that's good for school, but it's not really good for business. Okay, you really want predictability. So, also I think that there's visibility of costs, right? So many of the costs related to sustaining legacy products is really not a direct cost. It's not a cost of material, it's not direct labor, it's into that overhead. So it makes it very difficult for people to see exactly how much legacy products are costing them. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, inertia. People just don't like to change, me included, right? Okay, but let me be clear and be fair. Embedded OEMs and people in this room absolutely do amazing things every single day to help their customers, okay? From Awesome. Thanks. I gotta reset my timer.
I'll remind you.
Perfect. No, I don't want to go over. Thanks, Jerry. Okay. So everybody in this room gets credit. And a lot of times customers really, a lot of times don't even see all of this kicking duck feet under the water, right? So we are really coming through for our customers. Okay, but I got a couple of case studies where it hasn't quite worked out very well. So the first one is a Navy client of ours. They have had 16 circuit card assemblies in their radar system, and from 5 embedded OEMs. All but one of them found some way, with us and without us, a legacy equipment manufacturer like GDCA, to help the customer. But one didn't. What they did was they handed off the product to a distributor, all of their surplus stock, and then that distributor, as they do, was kind of their intent was to kind of jack up the price and then try to get the customer into a huge last time buy. Unfortunately, this didn't work for the customer at all, and after much hand-wringing and hat-passing, they were able to at least fund the beginning of a technology refresh, which one would say, hey, success for the OEM. Unfortunately, part of the specification in the engineering spec was that OEM, because of lack of service on the previous version, actually it was 2 generations previous, was not eligible to even be part of the refresh. So in that situation, that was, not only did that OEM damage their brand, right? But also they destroyed long-term demand because that customer wanted low volume spares and repairs for another 20 years. And in the end, they kind of shortened that to 10 years. Another situation that I've come across was kind of a little bit longer ago, and that was around 2007. We had a long-standing partner, and then they, because of the Great Recession, kind of pivoted back to legacy products. They had great products, very sticky in the marketplace, and really held their top line pretty well during the pandemic. Unfortunately, about 5 years after, they really realized that their legacy products would not really sustain them, and certainly wouldn't make them grow. And it was kind of that classic frog in a boiling water situation where, oh my God, the water's boiling, but it took a while to understand that. And in the end, what they did was kind of exited the market. So these are some other things that people kind of dig themselves into a hole. And then there's other stories I can talk about around overstocking components. One OEM I know found themselves with $10 million in obsolete inventory after forecasts fell really short. And then low production yields. I was talking to an OEM just before the end of last year, and they had an order, it was a pretty modest order, that had been basically stuck in their production schedule for about 10 months because they hadn't built it very recently. Okay, let's talk about some situations where things have worked pretty well. When working between LEMs and OEMs, it follows kind of, 5 main kind of milestones. First, OEM gets contacted, then there's some sort of agreement in principle to move forward, and then they commence the restart of the line. That would be the LEM commences the restart of the production line, and then it goes through first article acceptance and then production order. That's the follow-on order. So let's talk about 2 case studies. One, video circuit card assembly for a forward-looking infrared system, that little pod on the front of that H60, that's a FLIR. And so the situation was that the Navy basically was working through the prime couldn't get a card from an OEM. We contacted that OEM in March of 2013, let's call that T0. We had a good standing relationship with that OEM, so in about 3 months after they were convinced that the Navy really could not upgrade and they needed just a little bit more, we got an agreement with them. Took us about 10 months to get funding from the Navy to restart the production line. And then it took us about 20 months to restart the actual production line, get first article acceptance, and then obviously for the Navy to actually run the acceptance. and then finally the production order. That was all told almost 4 years from the first time we contacted the OEM. The OEM was happy because they didn't have to do anything, and they made pretty much the same net profit as they would have made had they duked it out themselves. Navy, of course, was thrilled because they got their parts. Another one, signal processing for a single board computer, single processing card actually for the NATO Sea-Sparrow missile system. This is a slightly different situation. The Navy basically took over organic support for this part, and the Prime was no longer really involved. We contacted this other OEM, a different one, in February of 2020. Pretty quickly we got an agreement with them because their focus was really on helping the Navy. There wasn't a lot of money in it, but they kind of had a patriotic slant and customer focus. We got the money from the Navy about 7 months from the first time we contacted the OEM. First article acceptance took about a year. That's rebuilding the test equipment, solving some obsolescence, and going through FAU. That was actually pretty zippy. And in the end, it was about 30 months from T0 to the end. So again, on this one, the Navy was happy, but the OEM was really happy because in the end, they really didn't have to do too much. Though they did rebuild the test gear, but that was their choice. But it was contained. They knew exactly what they were getting into. And in the end, the handover to us was less than 8 hours. So in the end, I think OEMs really do have 3 choices. Okay, they can either not do legacy support at all, or they can try to do it themselves in-house, or they can maybe partner with an LEM. Now, if you want to move fast and make money, imposing that legacy surcharge for doing it yourself might not make the most sense. Okay, but if you partner with an LEM, then you really do get all of the benefits of their specialized skills, not the least of which is, as I mentioned, specialization, right? So I can say GDCA probably has about 100 years, person years invested in tools and techniques around sustainment. And that's not just technical stuff, that's also contracting a lot of the business stuff and convincing customers on whether it makes sense to stick or upgrade. Cost efficiency, that's another advantage that people get when they partner up with an OEM. And then focus on their core business, that's a really important thing. So speaking of that, long-term benefits of mastering legacy support. So I love this phrase, right? If you try to catch 2 rabbits by yourself, you're not going to catch any rabbits. Okay, you got to kind of pick a rabbit to chase, and trying to go after your core business while also trying to capture the skinny, fast legacy business is a really good way to not catch any rabbits. Okay, so, but working with a legacy equipment manufacturer, you have real benefits, right? Not only do you get customer retention, because actually sustaining legacy is a real problem, and customers really, it builds trust when you do sustain it. But also it gives you sustainable growth, right? Because you can drive and focus on that balance between old and new. And then finally, market leadership, right? This is a real thing. Okay. So in conclusion, right, I just would encourage everybody to take the bull by the horns. If you don't take the bull by the horns, the bull's horns are going to take you. And I would encourage everybody to kind of keep 2 things in mind. One, there are going to be customers who are going to need long-term support longer than it's comfortable for you to do it. And secondly, I think it's very important that people are in touch with how much it is really costing them to sustain legacy products. Okay, and I think that there are a lot of OEMs that LEMs have partnered with who have really benefited from these perspectives, and I think a lot of people in this audience might be able to also. Thank you.